Hello! Welcome to our second annual Climate Summit at Dreamforce. We are incredibly honored to have all of you here with us and incredibly honored to have Deloitte Digital as our partner for not only the Climate Summit, but for our Quality Summit today. I hope that you've joined us this morning for our first session of the day, which was incredible, and there's many more to come, both from equality and climate. I think we can all agree that the discourse in public around climate has changed this year. It was something that we thought about in potentially the intangible distant future, something that we were worried about, but it didn't quite feel for many people that it was here. But the youth voice brought that reality to today. It's a climate crisis. They helped us reframe and change our language. They helped us understand that it's no longer okay for those of us in the business community, in government, and other world leaders to turn a blind eye to this crisis. And we thank them. And we wanted to make sure that they were a part of the conversation, not only ongoing, but here at Dreamforce. So it's my honor to introduce this wonderful conversation with two youth activists that are inspiring us to do better. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who is also an inspirational leader of our time, Carlos Sanvi. He's the Secretary General of the World YMCA, an international office supporting 120 national YMCA movements, reaching 65 million people across the globe. Carlos has held a number of leadership roles throughout his more than 30 years in the YMCA, including Deputy General Secretary of his home YMCA in Togo and Secretary General of the African Alliance of YMCAs. We are incredibly fortunate to have you here to moderate this conversation. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. How are you? After this wonderful message from President Obama, I could say it won't be the same level, but this is the more important choice you have made today to come and listen to this great speaker, these great activists, young people who are making change in the community. So this topic, we don't need to introduce this anymore. If you are here, it's because you understand that we are in a planetary crisis, wherever we are, whichever is our position. Experts have been saying it, but no one was listening. Now, young people are taking the streets in our cities, in our businesses, and they are making some action. It seems that something now is happening. Why? Because they know that the climate crisis is going to affect more the future than the previous generation. It's not just the future, it starts affecting them already. And that's why seeing political leaders and business leaders often dismiss their concern is making them angry. Because this climate crisis is leading to climate anxiety. Some of them, like the two panelists here, have started developing the solution themselves. And there are many of them, thousands of them, all over the world, providing the solution. I'm from the YMCA, Secretary General of the World YMCA. We are a federation of 120 countries, reaching out to more than 60 million people across the world. But we have 45 million we call young people below the age of 30. And at least 11 million of them are for 14 to 25. This is the real category. And when we are listening to those young people, they are saying us many things that we were not able to hear before. But the immense mobilization of young people around the world is enable us to hear and also invite us as the YMCA to amplify their voice. Last February, when we start seeing this mobilization of young people around the world, it dawned on me that it's important that we support it publicly. At that time, many people were asking, why are they skipping school to do this? Why are they doing this? That's not very important. That's not very responsible. But as from YMCA, we thought that's very important. and personally connect to my own story. When I was 15 in my country, I come from Togo in West Africa. We have mining companies, open-air mining companies, phosphate. They will move village to another place so that they can mine that mineral. Hundreds and thousands of hectares. And after that, they leave this earth is like the moon. No one is happening because it's the main resource for our country. You can't do anything. Try to attack those people. They will give you one-way ticket to see your ancestors. So it's better not to do anything. But as the young people at that time, we said, we cannot just keep silent. So we start planting tree on our own, planting tree. They are destroying, we are planting a tree. It was not sustainable. It took years and years before some regulation, some external pressure. So when I see what those young people are doing, it just inspires me. That's why I invite YMCA, let's support them. I know many places in the world, YMCA is a place where the mobilization of young people were starting from. So today, I have these great, great young people. I wish when I was younger, I have them to inspire me more. I will be different from now today. So Youth Tekal is an environmental activist, hip-hop artist. This combination is very interesting. And he's the youth director of Earth Guardian, a worldwide conservation organization. Youth Tekal believe the most substantial things we can do as individuals is to create environmental change, is to educate people around the crisis, and that young people have the power to create significant social and environmental change. Brilliant. Alexandria, I saw you already in action. And she is a climate activist living in New York, a follower of the Friday for Future movement, and fellow climate activist Greta Thunberg. Alexandria is a co-founder of the US Climate Strike and founder of Earth Uprising. In May, she was recipient of the Disruptor Award from Tribeca Disruptive Innovation Award and received a scholarship from the Common Good Public Advocacy Organization and was awarded Youth Climate Leadership Prize from the Earth Day Network. So these brilliant activists are leading a generation of young people calling for action. So that's the introduction. Everybody knows that. I want to ask you this question. Alexandria, can you explain Alexandria for the dummies like me? How will you explain that? Who are you? Tell us something. What gives you that inspiration, that drive to be where you are today?
Yeah, so I guess what had gotten me involved with activism in the first place is I'm originally from Northern California. I live in Davis, California, but this past year I've been able to live in New York City while my mom did her master's. And so, of course, I'm still very connected with a lot of my family here. And so last year, I was actually visiting my family back in Davis when the Paradise Fire broke out. And so my hometown was very close to Paradise, so we ended up receiving a lot of the smoke from that fire. At one point, it was the worst air quality in the world. And so since the smoke was seeping into my home, it was, I had to roll up wet towels, put them under windows and doors. And so since it was inflaming my asthma so much, my family had to send me back to New York City early from that trip. And I was very upset and I was angry just about what had happened. And seeing how California is always on fire now, just a couple weeks ago, we had 9 fires throughout the state. And so because of that, I wanted to start researching, and I wanted to know why it was happening. And that's how I started to see the connection between climate change and California's wildfires. And so that made me want to take action once I saw the connection between it. And so after seeing Greta Thunberg speak at COP24, I knew what I could really do to go out and make my voice heard. And so that's why I ended up taking my climate anxiety and grief, and I turned it into action by going on school strike on December 14th of 2018. And so I've now been on strike every Friday as of tomorrow for the past 49 weeks. And so just really taking that action made me feel so much better. But recently, being back in California now, I went and I visited Paradise recently. And so when I visited Paradise, it was just so upsetting to see, but also seeing how Paradise won't be the last place that will have a devastation like that. And so I think what really fuels my passion to continue being an activist and making my voice heard is seeing its impacts on my own local community.
Wow. So from that anxiety, you turn it into action. Mm-hmm. Were your parents mad at you when you were not going to school? I think your father in the room, was he mad at you?
No, my parents were very supportive. Of course, the first day I told them, it was only a couple days before the first Friday when I went on strike. I ended up telling my parents about it. And at first, it was kind of funny because I'd never been an activist before. I'd never gone to a protest. And so I didn't really think that I could make a difference with the protests, and so the idea was just interesting. And so they were very supportive, and really once they saw the difference it was making on my mental health and well-being, but then they also saw how my generation does have a lot at stake. They understand how severe the climate crisis is. And so they were supportive of my climate strike. And also some of my friends, at first when I started striking, they didn't understand why, but I took it upon myself to really educate my friends and my family on why I was doing it. And so I'm starting to see those around me. Their mindset is changing. So I have some friends who are just becoming activists in their own ways now.
Wow. Okay. So how many of you have heard Alessandria speaking before at the United Nations? How many? Raise your hand. Okay. So, you know, there's something called YouTube. You can go and look for it and see how she speaks. And you can also learn that you might not be born activist, but you can learn how to do it. She's the perfect example of that. Yuftekal, I saw you in action several times. You know, generally, we call the earth Mother Earth. But when I see you, it's like you are the mother of the earth. You behave like being the mother. Why? What happened to you?
For sure. Just want to introduce myself quickly too, in my language and the way that I was taught to. Piali nanotuka shutes katonatiu, nochanompa yonim boler Colorado altepet. My name is Shutes Katonatiu. Honored to be here. Just want to acknowledge that the land that we are standing upon is stolen land of the Ohlone and the Rumsen people. And it's important any space that we go into, whether it's for a conference, for traveling, to acknowledge that, you know, everywhere that we're going in this nation is stolen land from Indigenous and First Nations peoples. And for me, I think that awareness and that understanding of our place as guardians of the earth, as protectors of our water, stems less, I think, from solely this perspective of activism. I think we've done a really good job as a society of tricking ourselves into believing that in order to care about certain things that everyone should be caring about, like having clean water or, you know, healthy air to breathe, you have to identify yourself a certain way. You have to be a political activist, or you have to be an organizer, or you have to be a public speaker, or you have to be on a stage or protesting. And in reality, before I got involved in any of that, and I've done all those things for the last, 16 years of my life, 13 years of my life or so. And before I got involved in any of that, the foundation was laid, I think, by the way that I was raised in the culture of my father and our ancestors, the Mexica peoples. My peoples are the Mexica peoples, the indigenous traditional peoples of Mexico Tenochtitlan of Mexico City. And so much of the way we were raised is that it is our responsibility to be those that carry on and preserve our cultural ways of life. Our language, our dances, our teachings, our songs, the spirituality, the cosmology, the mathematics of our ancestors. And with that was many of these ideological teachings around our responsibility to preserve the land that we stand upon, to defend the sacred. For us, when we look at an issue like the climate crisis, which is so all-encompassing, which is so much more than just an environmental issue. For indigenous peoples, it's a threat to our cultural survival. And anybody, regardless of who you are, or where you're from, or the color of your skin, or the God you believe in, or the country your ancestors were born in, for us as human beings, the climate crisis is a threat to our cultural survival. That's not a unique thing for indigenous peoples. Many indigenous nations have held that understanding very closely because of how directly our survival and our existence has been threatened, not just by the climate crisis, saying storms and the increase in temperature and wildfires, but the whole foundation of what this crisis is has been perpetuated from many of these same systems that, you know, colonized and exploited resources and peoples and took the land of the indigenous peoples of this continent and of territories all over the globe. But really, I think for all of us, it's reframing the way we see this as less of just like, oh, this is an existential environmental cause that is affecting ice caps and sea level rise. But no, this is everything we care about. You know, every aspect of human culture is at stake because of a crisis that we have created over the last, you know, just a couple generations, really.
So it's a kind of way of living. But there is a cliche. People think that this way of living is just for the so-called indigenous people. Do you think this is something for everybody can have that way of living? Or is it just something specific to certain people?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at the future that we're building, the way that I like to frame a lot of these conversations and the way in which I think about these issues is opportunities for bringing the world into a new space that, you know, we haven't existed in before. About innovation, and I think a lot of principles of the modern world are guiding us in a direction that is going to continue to push for progress and technological development. And I know there's a lot of really smart people in the room and at this conference that are at the head of, you know, many of these companies that are continuously revising our ideology of what we thought was possible. And at the same time, as we are in this constant race for information and knowledge and wealth and accumulation of power, I think one of the guiding principles that needs to help lead us into the future is many of these teachings and ways of life and understandings that indigenous peoples have carried with us, have literally given our lives for generations to keep alive. And we need that to be a part of the world we are bringing into the future, that we are passing on to the next generations. I think a lot of these indigenous teachings around sovereignty and decolonization and living in harmony and in balance with nature, those don't need to be radical ideologies. Like, our ancestors have been living in balance with the earth for generations, and I think if we look at our society and where we want to go, it's not going to be possible if we don't remind ourselves of many of these old teachings and old ways that our grandmothers, our elders, our aunties have been passing on. And so, no, these ideas and these perspectives that are often seen as very indigenous teachings and ways of life do not just belong to any one people. They were kept alive because of the struggles of specific groups. And now is the time more than ever for indigenous voices to be at the forefront of the conversations that are going to be guiding the direction that the world is going towards, so that we can teach everybody to live and learn and walk our lives. Whether we are entrepreneurs or artists or doctors or storytellers, we can walk in a way that honors and acknowledges many of these old teachings that need to be revived in, you know, the mainstream and among the masses for us to find a more holistic way to move forward. So I think it's a cultural shift that needs to happen alongside with a lot of political change, alongside with a lot of transition of our economic systems. But I think the cultural shift that happens, you know, by touching people's hearts and reminding people of where we come from. And, you know, white people, European people, like ancestrally, there's a lot of tribes and groups of people across Europe that had many of these same ideologies as well. You know, from pagan peoples and many different cultures that had this understanding of respecting and honoring nature. So it's like it is in all of us. You know, we are all drinking the same water. We are all breathing the same air. We are all indigenous to this earth because this is the only home that we got.
So, living in harmony with self, with nature, and with the others. That's what I took from you, to say this is given to everybody. We should all make sure that we learn how to live in harmony at those three levels, because it's not just for indigenous, but as a human being, we need to find these three harmony, working on that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when we look at the climate crisis too, is it threatens so many other parts of our lives and our world that are so important to maintain balancing, from conflict and war to displacement and the increase in climate refugees. You know, seeing estimates for 1 billion people displaced by the climate crisis by the end of the century. That's the weight of that is predominantly going to be left on Black, brown, and indigenous folks. So we see, you know, many of these other aspects of our society that aren't always communicated as parts of like the mainstream environmental narrative when we talk about impacts. But truly define, a harmonious society further than just clean air and clean water and a healthy environment. But we think about peace, we think about access to healthcare, we think about, access to education, to good food. A lot of those are going to be revolving around the stability of the climate system. So it's all very woven together. They're not three separate things, but it's like the harmony that we found within ourselves is going to reflect what happens in the climate, and that's going to be determined by us.
Alessandria, how do you make sure that the voice of young people or your voice is heard? Because the system is not necessarily set to listen to what young people are saying, to listen to those in pain are saying. How do you make sure that those voices are heard?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of young people who we really do need to be involved in the decision-making process. And I think that right now with the current youth movement, what I'm starting to see is that we are making our voices heard at every level. We're at protests, at legal actions. And so we are really persuading politics. And so, for example, in New York City, I've been organizing the climate strikes there. And so one of our most successful climate strikes that we had, where we really influenced the decision makers, is where on May 3rd, we had a national climate strike. And so in New York City, we had over 1,000 students who had a sit-in on the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, this was very spontaneous. It was almost a last-minute decision that we had. And so while sitting in on the Brooklyn Bridge, we were demanding Mayor Bill de Blasio declares a New York City climate emergency. And of course, he didn't. But that same day, we had the New York City Council. They had drafted a resolution for it. And so we continued to push for this climate emergency on our next global climate strikes, and we ended up getting it. And so I think what I'm starting to notice is that the youth, we aren't stopping. We're making our voices heard to the point where those in power have to listen to us. And so, for example, OPEC, they called the youth movement the #1 threat to the oil industry.
Wow.
And so we're seeing that the youth movement, we really are threatening those who are polluting our planet.
Can you believe that? Can you believe that? Young people. Wow.
And so I think it's just the passion that we have for protecting our environment is one of the things that really makes us not stop. And as well with the youth movement, what makes the Friday strikes so strong is that it's consistent. It's that consistent act of civil disobedience every single Friday. And so we're disrupting the system by that. And it's because we're not going to stop. We're going to make sure that we do make those in power hear our voices. Because when our politicians are being persuaded by money, it's not right for young people to just sit by and watch that happen. And so that's why we're on the streets protesting.
So you're going not to stop. You're going to continue.
Yes, I think the youth movement, it's going to continue. It's going to get even stronger just because we are on such a tight deadline. We have less than 11 years as put forth by the IPCC report. And so that means that we really have to make our demands clear on a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, making sure that we have renewable energy, holding polluters accountable, and then making sure that all of our solutions are equitable. And so with that deadline, it also gives us so much more urgency. One thing that I'm seeing with politicians is they're looking at what is politically possible. And so, but they're also thinking about how we don't need to act now on the climate crisis because it isn't that urgent. They think it's a future issue. But the youth are consistently there making sure that they know that this issue is right now and it's affecting everyone right now.
And I just want to reflect on something as well. I think this is the second time we've been on a panel together in the last couple months. And first of all, I feel old. Now, I'm 19, and I got started when I was 6, so I've been doing this forever. Way before there was like a whole generation of young people who were vocal and who were outspoken and who were given the spotlight and a platform to be able to share their stories, their perspective, their leadership, their voices. And for me now, I was at the strike in New York in September, and there was like 300,000 people in the streets, and it was this incredible moment. And I was looking out at the crowd from the stage, and I was like, oh, these kids are so much younger than me. It's crazy. And I think that really speaks to, hearing how eloquent and how poised you are. Like, this girl's not even out of middle school yet. You're an eighth grade student. And for me, it's so powerful to remember where I was at when I was your age, and now to think about the movement has evolved exponentially since then. The crisis has evolved exponentially since then. And our generation has really risen to meet that. And I think you're an example of that. And I think the beautiful part of young people like you and I is we're no longer the few out there that A, have a story and something to share with the world, and B, are being heard. Now we are amidst a generation of millions of young people who are standing up, sharing their voices in the streets, in our courts, through their art forms, through diverse tactics and ways that many of us didn't really ever associate with activism. And so it's just beautiful to be able to like look at where we are at as a movement. And you know, when I was 15, a lot of my peers were like a lot of older white people and a lot of like university college students, and to see how the distribution of power has gotten younger and younger and younger, because at earlier ages we are coming to our senses of saying like, this is the most important issue. How are we gonna go and pursue careers or life paths in school and higher education when fundamentally the future 10 years down the road, 50 years down the road is not being considered by those in power today? And so I'm just like incredibly proud of you and your voice and the work you've done and how much you inspire me to continue my work. And I think it's a very telling moment, you know, both saying how our generation is the greatest threat to the oil and gas industry. We have been fighting this for a long time. My ancestors, you know, generations before me, my mom started the organization that I'm working on. And that now is just like such a beautiful moment. I think that really is cause for celebration to see how we are rewriting the story of what has been projected upon our movements. And as young people, we are crafting our own narrative. And I think every time we show up in the streets, every time we show up in our courts, every time we continue to clarify the vision of the future we want, and we are working together to build, it's a very powerful time. And so, you know, the urgency is very great. And so there's a lot of really dope young people doing a lot of good stuff. I want to see every adult in this room rise up to meet that. Because just because you're not a youth does not mean you are off the hook and that you don't have a part to play in this.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for saying that, because when you start talking, you say, she make you feel old. I was feeling like a dinosaur. But you just make it. It's all of us. So we don't want the dinosaur also to disappear on the earth. We need to be there. But Alexandria, you met some politicians at high level. Tell us a story of something that is so weird that you came out of those meetings that make you feel, oh, this needs to continue.
Well, I think, I'd mentioned it before. I have been able to meet with a lot of politicians and discuss our demands with them, and they're always just looking at what is politically possible, and they're always looking at both sides of the conversation. And so they're not really acting on what needs to happen to solve the climate crisis, and so that's why for September 20th, it was a very impactful day in New York City, especially because we had set up a lot of meetings with our politicians and our New York City council members, and we were really pushing them to excuse all the students on September 20th to go on climate strike and have them have an excused absence, because this was the day, this was the week before world leaders flew into New York City for the United Nations Climate Summit. So it was very impactful, and we needed all of the 1.1 million students out there on the streets protesting. And so I think that with those meetings with the New York City Council members, even though politicians are very slow, I've noticed. And so that's why we continuously sent them emails. And it wasn't just one person, it was all of the New York City students who were involved in this. And we're really excited for the 20th to make their voices heard. And so we continued making sure that those council members knew that we were going to continue to demand that they allow students to strike. And so I think that that's one of the most successful meetings I've had with any of the council members or politicians.
Yurseka, you with your 20 of your friends, you sued the US government. What's wrong with you?
It's funny because we've been in a legal battle against the federal government of the United States, against the executive branch of the US, since 2015. So for the last 4 years, we have been demanding that the government be held accountable by the courts for violating our constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property, for actively perpetuating the climate crisis, for supporting the oil and gas and fossil fuel industries, for essentially the fostering and the creation of this crisis knowingly. And it's been a crazy battle. We initially, no disrespect to the homie Obama, but we initially filed it against the Obama administration in 2015 and transferred over to the Trump administration. And quite groundbreaking. I think most political analysts and legal experts that looked at the case didn't think it had any chance at all. And 4 years later, we are still heading towards trial. The Trump administration has thrown a slew of different legal approaches to try to get it dismissed and taken out of the courts. And time again, judges have sided on our behalf, saying that young people do have a constitutional right to a healthy climate, essentially. And so, what's even crazy is this has been, something I've had a huge stake in for the last 4 years. This has been us as 21 youth plaintiffs. Each of us have our own story of how we're being impacted by the climate crisis. When you're talking about wildfires, I felt very sympathetic and I related to that a lot, because in Colorado, the first time I experienced the climate crisis firsthand was when my family was evacuated because there was a wildfire across the street from our homes back in 2010, 2011. Year after year, the record-breaking wildfires are getting worse. So this case against the federal government combines the best available science, working with some of the top climate scientists to create a prescription for a climate recovery plan to be implemented at the highest level of government, balanced with these stories, these compelling stories of these young kids from the age of, the youngest plaintiff is now 12. He started when he was 8 or 9. And the oldest plaintiff is 23. And so it's a combination of the science, the legal aspect, an incredible legal team that we have on board, and these stories. And I feel like you should take this opportunity to talk to us about your case, because they actually one-upped us and sued the world. And I'm gonna let you handle that.
Well, yeah, so I am a part of a complaint that happened to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. So myself, Greta Thunberg, and 14 other children had filed a complaint to the Committee on the Rights of the Child stating that Argentina, Brazil, Germany, Turkey, and France were violating our rights by their inaction on the climate crisis. And so really, with this complaint, what I think is so powerful about it is that it really does showcase how children all around the world, their rights are being violated right now because there's more hurricanes, floods, wildfires that's disrupting their life. And that's becoming the new normal for a lot of children. And it's very unfair to them. And so really, when looking at this complaint, I looked at Article 6 on the Convention of the Rights of the Child that states that young people have an inherent right to life. But the climate crisis was directly impacting that. And so that's really why I think this complaint was very impactful. But I do love how more young people are taking legal action. So the case here, and then Canada as well, had just there are new young people who filed a case to Canada. And so I think that just seeing how more young people were on the streets, but then we're also taking the legal action, so we're holding them accountable on that level, just shows how we're becoming even more creative on how to hold our world leaders accountable.
And I'm in talks right now with friends in Mexico and Mexico City who are working on a case against the Mexican government as well on similar terms. And I think when we look at the moment we are in and where we draw our inspiration from, many of us, and I think it's very commonly spoken of in the Sunrise Movement, but looking towards the civil rights era as a time that we cite that has inspired the massive amount of change that is needed in this country and in this world. And when we look back at the civil rights, this massive mobilization of strategic nonviolent civil disobedience, this massive mobilization of peoples, of youth out in the streets, leading to incredible groundbreaking proceedings in the courts, leading to the Civil Rights Act. And from that, we see different moments in the history of our movement as well, from the fight against the Keystone XL pipeline, where years of protests, of demonstration, of, again, strategic arrest and nonviolent direct action led to the Obama administration denying access for the Keystone XL pipeline passing through the United States. The same thing, or similar things are continuing to manifest when the Sunrise Movement occupied and did a sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office, which then propelled the Green New Deal to be one of the most talked about things in this political race, in this presidential race amongst Democratic candidates, and has completely shifted the atmosphere around the political conversation of the climate crisis. So time and time again, we are seeing that young people asserting our power, our passion, our voices, our leadership into these spaces, on the streets, in our courts, politically, is changing the game. And we are at a time in history where that is needed more than ever. And for all of you as our supporters, allies, friends, people who are watching this from the sidelines, like, we need you to get in the thick of it. That doesn't mean that we need you to, necessarily be always striking with us. You need to become an activist, but it's like that, bigger than anything, and I think more important than anything is for each and every one of us, each and every one of you, to think about and understand that you have a part to play in this work, in this movement, more than anything in this moment in history. Because this is going to be, I think, a very tipping point moment. The next several years are going to determine the next several hundred years, and you have a part to play.
Well, let's be practical here. We have in the room a lot of business leaders. So the legal action, if that goes through, how do you think it's going to affect them? And do you have advice for them?
Well, really, for all of you here in the room, I think my advice to you would be to become a fan of the youth climate movement. And so by that, I mean F stands for fund, A stands for amplify, and N stands for narrate. And so when it comes to funding, I'm seeing that a lot of youth, they really need their voices heard for a lot of youth that really are experiencing the effects of the climate crisis right now. And so what I'm seeing is when it comes to youth activism, there is this economic divide. And so a lot of youth who are able to go and speak, their voices are heard more than those who are being affected. And so that's why I think being able to fund and make sure that those who are affected the most by the climate crisis are able to go and make their voices heard. And then for A, amplify. When there are legal actions, when there are protests, you can amplify the message of the youth climate strikers to those around you, to politicians, and you can also help amplify us when we're organizing and connect us with those. And then for N stands for narrate. So I really think it's important for all of you to tell your own climate story because it is unique. And so when your climate story, when you tell it to those who will listen, but then also tell your climate story to those who won't, because we need to be talking about how we're being affected to everyone. And so really what I'm seeing is with personal stories as well, that we are influencing our politics. When you're talking to those about what's happening in your community, then you can make sure that you get policy changes. I think when some are being affected in communities all around the world, what's important about having them involved is because they know what needs to happen in their community to really mitigate the effects of the climate crisis. So make sure to talk about your own climate story. So I invite all of you to become a fan of the youth climate movement.
There you go.
That's great. That's great. But listen to you, we have the impression that it's so easy. You just do it. But I'm sure, because I talk to a lot of young people, we meet a lot of young people, it's not that easy. Can you explain some of those women when you felt so low, you felt like giving up? What happened? What make you low? And what are those specific moments that you are close to giving up?
I feel like being involved in this work, it's inevitable to have your moments of apathy, of hopelessness, of disconnect. And I'm really fortunate and grateful to be surrounded by a community of other young warriors who are doing this work and who have been doing this work. Like, lift each other up, hold each other's hands through the tough parts. We lose a lot. Like, in this movement, there's a lot of moments where things don't go our way, whether that's getting ballot initiatives voted on to protect our communities from the impacts of the fossil fuel, the natural gas industry in Colorado, whether that's the expansion of existing well pads in my community, my home, whether that's reading and watching social media and seeing the wildfires on the other side of the planet, where it's like, well, what do you even do about that? And it's heavy, those moments happen, and I think talking about it's really important, telling stories about it's really important. I think for all of us and for all of you, it's like frame this in a way that connects and relates to you. Not everybody can relate to wildfires, not everybody can relate to sea level rise and tropical storms like what we've experienced so much in the south of the US. Not everybody can relate to having fossil fuel infrastructure in your backyard. And I think one thing to recognize too is if you're privileged enough to not be able to relate to a lot of that stuff, then that means like the most significant impacts of the climate crisis, if they're not directly impacting you and your family and your community, then you have a really big part to play for all of those who are on the front lines, who do not have the same amount of energy and time, because so many people are so every single day figuring out survival and looking at all the different things wrapped up in climate injustice, like economic injustice, like racial injustice, all these different experiences that many communities are going through, and leverage your privilege to help people who are being displaced by the climate crisis right now, who are losing family members to air quality pollution, to air pollution right now. And so it's in the moments of despair and of hopelessness, like, you got to come together and you have to find that community, because there's a lot of other people out there who are on that same page, and it takes really, I think, that sense of camaraderie and friendship and community to be able to transition, as you were talking about, that climate anxiety, that climate despair into climate action.
Okay, what about you, Alessandra? What's make you slow? What make you feel giving up?
I think one thing that really upsets me is when we are in this ecosystem and our biodiversity is collapsing. I think for me, I've always been very connected with nature. In Davis, we have this amazing arboretum where there's ducks, there's turtles, there's just really amazing wildlife there. And so what really upsets me is when we are losing just the wildlife on our planet. There's the Rio bluebird went extinct, koalas are functionally extinct, and I think that that's one thing that also makes me so upset, is how we are fighting for the future of our generation, but also for the future of a lot of the species on this planet.
Yeah. Okay, so what will happen next? Let's, for a matter of time, what are the two likely scenarios that you think? What's good scenario and bad scenario? How do you think this movement is going to grow? What can you tell the leaders here?
I think for me, one thing that really I would like to see is more just action on the streets. Right now, we're in this moment where we are building up to more actions, more Friday strikes, and just other unique ways of doing civil disobedience. And really what I want to see is our world leaders really follow the IPCC report and reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions. And so really finding ways to make your voice heard on the street or any way possible is what I really want to see happen in the next couple of months.
And as far as, regardless of what happens, of whether we make the IPCC report and reduce global greenhouse gas emissions at the rate that is necessary, a lot of people are going to die and suffer, more so than are already experiencing that right now. And so the idea of like stopping the climate crisis isn't really a thing. We're living it every day. Whether you've experienced that from the wildfires here in Northern California, whether, you've been watching what's happening in the South Pacific with island nations already sinking and populations being relocated and the increase in climate refugees. And so this question is like, will we act quick enough to avoid, the runaway effect that is going to be hit if we don't mobilize our global community? And that means everybody has a part to play. If we're going to make it out in a certain light, it's only going to be if we do it together. And that means everybody from people in the business sector, in education, in policy, on the streets, in our courts. It really has to be a holistic shift. Just striking is not enough. Just a Green New Deal is not enough. Just voting for a certain candidate is not enough. But engaging in the political process, engaging in on-the-ground community organizing, engaging in, looking at your workplace, your place of work, and thinking about how you can leverage your connections in your, whatever it is that you do or the ways you live your life to engage with the world. That's where your role comes in. And we are in a very difficult moment. And at the end of the day, we are fighting to defend and protect what we love. That is, I think, at the foundation of many of the different social movements of our time that are really going to shape this moment in history. And we all have a part to play. This is not about being activists. This is about recognizing the power you have to shape the future, that the power is in the collective. The power is not just on waiting for political change. The power is in engaging and starting from the bottom up and seeing as many of the greatest changes throughout history have ever happened. People, young people, all people, a diverse intersectional group of peoples across the board have been at the forefront of pushing for that. And that's what this moment needs. We need to divide. We need to get rid of divides and borders and barriers and bring people together around this, because it is a defining issue of our time, and it's going to be really interesting to see how these next 10 years play out, and I'm excited to be alongside each and every one of y'all.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. And to all of us, if there's something we need to go with today, is that it's not just about young people, it's about all of us. We have the arts in our hands, and let's make it sustainable. It's our responsibility to make it happen. And let's not antagonize the young people. Let's make us our friend and make sure that when we meet next year, we can see that something concrete is happening. So again, thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.